Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, good morning to all. Good morning to also the online attendance to this session 2 of Subteam 2 of the 15th World Forestry Congress. And this session will deal with sustainably managed forests for biodiversity. And without further ado, I will call to the floor our keynote speaker, Dr. Robert Nazy, Director General of CIFOR and Managing Director of CIFOR Aircraft. Robert, the floor is yours.
Merci, Vincent. Good morning, everybody. Can we have the slide on the screen? So, what is it to manage forests for sustainable use and biodiversity? And this whole idea of mainstreaming biodiversity into the forestry sector is not really new. I remember being part of a study maybe like 15 years ago by UNEP on the biodiversity support planning program, where was the issue of how do you mainstream biodiversity into productive sector. But it is getting a renewed importance given that there is a need to provide a growing population with forest products. Everything else being equal, we still use, every one of us, 0.5 cubic meter of wood per year and per person. So having 8 billion people and quite soon 10 means that we still need to produce a significant amount of wood material. There is also the idea of moving from a fossil fuel economy into a bio-based economy. That means that if we want to replace cement or concrete or other product by wood, we need more wood than we are producing now. And that means that, again, I mean, sort of this wood has to come from the forestry sector. I mean, the only way that we managed to produce wood so far has been by using trees. And there is also, at the same time, the imperative to conserve biodiversity and the associated goods and services like pollination, water, carbon, you name it. So how should we meet the demand for wood while minimizing climate and biodiversity impact? And that's the whole idea of this mainstreaming thing. Now, why non-protected area matters for biodiversity? Because we could say, okay, if we want to protect biodiversity, we have protected area, and why should we bother with biodiversity outside of protected area? And there are many reasons for that, but I will just use a very simple example. On the left side, you see this graph, and it's apes, gorilla, and chimpanzee nest density per kilometer square. And you see that in green, it's hunting areas, in red, it's logging concession, and in blue, is national park. And you can see you have more nest area in the hunting and the logging concession that you have in the national park. And WCS ran a study a few years ago, and they find out that, in fact, there is more gorilla and chimpanzee in West Africa than we were expecting, but 80% of these apes are outside of protected area. So there is quite a lot of biodiversity in the production forest, and that's why it's important in terms of biodiversity to look at the non-protected area. At the same time, forest and biodiversity, forests provide habitat for 80% of the amphibian species, 75% of the bird species, and 68% of the mammal species. I mean, if you have a map, this is from a paper in 2019, that showed the forest biodiversity intactness and the forest biodiversity significance. You see that there is a lot of congruence between high biodiversity, biodiversity intactness, and forest existence. But forests, as we said, are also a productive sector. We build skyscraper made out of wood. The wood demand is likely to rise by about 450 million cubic meter per year in 2030, and everything else being equal. Forests create jobs, wealth. So it's a very important production, a very important economic sector. So back to the question, can we manage for both? Can we manage for productivity and for biodiversity? And here, just a little bit of concept. I mean, when you manage forest for biodiversity or with biodiversity in mind, you can have a sort of an inactive element. I say that fundamentally the forest management tool or that you use maintain biodiversity by the way you design the road, the skid trail, the way you do the inventory. It can be coincident. That means that by whatever reason, the fact that you harvest the forest, you open area, creates conditions for a more biodiverse. So you have a different mosaic in the landscape. So you have young places where they are colonized by different animals. You have old growth. So it's, or you can be managing actively for both biodiversity and wood and other products. So you can be anywhere in this continuum. And I'm going to show you a few examples of real-life examples of that is possible. And we'll start the first one with a sort of seeing certified logging concession as extension of protected area in the Congo Basin. And you can see on the left chart of this is Gabon and the map of concession area, protected area. So you can see that they are surprisingly close neighbors. And there are several stories that show that if you are managing properly and if you have a closed concession and a closed logging area, you can use the logging concession as an extension for the protected area. And this has been empirical proof. And there was a recent thesis on that, showing that certified logging concession can play a complementary role to protected area in the implementation of conservation strategies. So that's one way of mainstreaming biodiversity in a very somewhat topical sector. Now, is there a life after logging? And this is the title of a book that we wrote with some colleagues a few years ago. I mean, and yes, protecting intact forests is critical for the biodiversity conservation and climate change mitigation, but the contribution of logged over forests in these twin goals should not be overlooked. And that's the point. I mean, a sort of a logged over forest may have less commercial timber, but still a lot of biodiversity value. And as some colleagues put it shortly in paper Nature, a logged forest in Borneo is better than none at all. And can you get your timber and your Brazil nut at the same time? And that's also a very interesting story. I mean, some colleagues a few years ago in Brazil, in fact, more in Bolivia, looked at there are more timber. There is more timber coming out of Brazil nut concession than there is timber coming out of timber concession. And so they were wondering, how is it possible? I mean, this extraction of timber, does it create canopy damage that will impair the production of Brazil nut? And then they realized that under a certain intensity, you can still harvest your timber on significant value on a tree per hectare and have the production of Brazil nut. So in the same place of forest, you produce timber, Brazil nut, and you maintain biodiversity. And there's sort of the classical issue of plantation. Now, plantation can be what you see on the left, monoclonal plantation of eucalypts, or it can be what you see on the right, agroforestry system, complex agroforestry system. And that's something very important. I mean, we need plantation. As of today, plantation represents something like 7 or 10% of the forest cover, but they produce near than 50% of the wood that we need. So if we want wood fiber, we will need to rely in one way or the other on plantation, and we need to think carefully how do you do this plantation so that they take into account also biodiversity. And it's not to say that there is something inherently bad on planting monoclonal eucalyptus plantation, depending on what you do. And there is not something also inherently bad in plantation. Plantation are very useful and can be a way to mainstream biodiversity in the forestry sector. And of course, you all know the importance of indigenous people and local community. And there is ample evidence that production forests managed by a local community have shown that they are good at producing goods and services and maintaining biodiversity. And one very good example is the northern Petén region of Guatemala, where they had this community concession that have been granted for 25 years and renewed in 2021 for another 25 years, where people harvest very valuable commercial timber like mahogany, and at the same time harvest the fatty palm for non-timber forest product. And study shows clearly that there is less deforestation, less degradation, less biodiversity loss in this community forest concession than in the adjacent national parks. And we don't remiss not to talk about the importance of indigenous lands for biodiversity. Indigenous land have equal or higher biodiversity than protected area in many cases. And more or less, indigenous people control something like 35 or 40% of the forest cover. And we have seen empirical evidence that show that there is a reduced deforestation and degradation in indigenous land pantropically. So indigenous people have been the steward of these lands for a long time, and they managed to produce, extract what they needed from the land, and at the same time protect the biodiversity. So this is another way also of mainstreaming biodiversity in the productive sector. So there are few rules in terms of if you want to do that you need to apply, and they're pretty generic. And I'm sure that my colleague later will tell you about the study that CIFOR, ICRAF, FAO have done on this issue of mainstreaming biodiversity in the forestry sector. But first, this requires a proper enabling environment and legal framework. And that's something that is very often an issue. Very often, the forestry law is not very conducive to the biodiversity element, or the biodiversity or environment sector is not very conducive to the productive sector. So we need to have something that make in a way that you can do both these things, manage for these things in the same place. And the whole issue very often is the issue of maximizing yield. And in fact, if you want to manage for biodiversity and productivity, it's a question of not maximization, but it's a question of optimization. How can you produce everything on the same landscape and not maximize systematically one production, but having some trade-off? And this whole issue of segregation at the landscape level, you can have production forest, you can have protected area, you can have urban center. You have to look at the overall view, and overall view is the landscape produce what you need and maintain the biodiversity. At the stand scale, then you need to have trade-off. In some places, it's not possible to have everything kept. When you are harvesting timber, you have bulldozer, you are cutting trees, you're making damage. But if you maintain that properly at the landscape level, then you can accept this trade-off at the scale. And then it should be based, for the economics, on the product or the service that has the highest net present value, because that's the one that will give you the economic incentive, the financial incentive and resources to manage for this product. And then, as I said, you need to consider the possible mode of interaction, and depending on what you do in terms of biodiversity, multiple use, and production, looking at whether these are independent, so you can manage for both independently, competitive. If you manage for one, you will have a reducing a trade-off or a foregone something on the other one, or complementary. If you manage for both, in fact, you get more of the two. So that's fundamentally what it is. And that's it. I mean, and I hope that you have been convinced that it is possible. We can do it. And now I'm sure that my colleagues in the rest of the session will tell you how we do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert, for an inspiring speech that sets the tone for this dynamic session. That's the protocol. I forgot to mention in the short introduction that this session has been co-organized by FAO-CIFOR, ITTO, and the CBD Secretariat. So thanks to all the colleagues involved in the setup of this session. And without further ado, I'll call to the panel Thomas Hofer from the Forestry Division of FAO to talk about this review on mainstreaming biodiversity in forestry that we started some months ago with FAO.
Thank you, Vincent. And we always have these additional tools here, you know, to put on or to put off. these masks, so I thank you. So good morning to all of you. Welcome to this session, which, as you know, is the second session under the sub-theme on nature-based solutions for climate mitigation. So I will briefly introduce a study, next slide, so, which in fact was implemented with CIFOR colleagues on the request of CIFOR, on the Committee on Forestry, you see here on the slide. So CIFOR 25 highlighted the critical role of forests and forestry in biodiversity conservation. I mean, it sounds obvious, but it's not that obvious, in fact, in practice. And CIFOR 25 requested FAO to raise awareness on the drivers of forest biodiversity loss and how to address these, to step up actions to halt deforestation, forest degradation, and loss of forest biodiversity, and support members in their efforts. And to do that, as an important step, to conduct a review of biodiversity mainstreaming in forestry and share good practices and on solutions that balance conservation and sustainable use of forest biodiversity. So basically what Robert explained in his keynote, it's exactly what this is. So it's to see how we can balance the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. So use of biodiversity is not contradictory with conservation. That's what I think the message is. Here you see the process of this study. It's basically a 2-year study which started at CIFOR 25 in 2020 and will be presented with the final document at CIFOR 22 this year in October. So we are at the World Forestry Congress here in May, early May, and we are basically presenting you the key findings of that study. So what I will do now is I will go through the main parts of this study, and I do this on behalf, in fact, of my colleague Kenichi Shono, who is online with us today and who is the main orchestrator from our team for the study and in the whole process. So what are some of the key findings? Sustainable management of forests managed for production and other benefits outside protected areas has a critical role in biodiversity conservation. That's what Robert also said. I mean, we are dealing here with mainstreaming biodiversity outside protected areas here, so in production landscapes, basically. Managing biodiversity in production forests is a search for optimal outcomes across multiple objectives and benefits. So outside protected areas, obviously, sustainable forest management, there are many interests, there are many needs, and when we talk about biodiversity mainstreaming, it's basically to search for an optimal outcome across these objectives and benefits. Biodiversity underpins benefits and services provided by forests and is covered under the concept of sustainable forest management, very importantly. And unfortunately, forest biodiversity continues to decline. So effective interventions are needed to better mainstream biodiversity within the forestry sector. So that's an overarching, obviously, finding which we need to take very seriously. Further findings are that biodiversity mainstreaming in forestry involves, in fact, a harmonization of environmental policies and regulations with those governing forests. So it's going beyond the forestry sector, so the whole environmental policies and regulations need to be harmonized with those governing forests. And the second point, equally important, identifying synergies with other areas of government policies. So to make sure there is a coherence across policies which are going beyond forests for biodiversity mainstreaming. And finally, the national biodiversity adaptation plans, the NDCs, the restoration commitments, and so on, they all provide important opportunities and frameworks to leverage biodiversity mainstreaming in forests. And finally, the third slide here, there are a variety of approaches and tools available for biodiversity mainstreaming. That's another important part. So, for example, spatial-based approaches, landscape approaches, upstream, downstream linkages in watersheds, whatever it is. Species-based approaches. We saw from Robert, plantations, they can be monoculture or they can be very diverse. So species-based approaches. Regulatory instruments, that's more the legal part to it. Economic instruments, incentives, conservation, payment for ecosystem services, all these instruments are part of these approaches. Participatory forest management, very important. That's an approach which is fundamental, that there is participation by all stakeholders when we want to achieve biodiversity mainstreaming in forests, and the support to knowledge and capacity development. So these are the main findings of the study. There are barriers, in fact, and threats to biodiversity mainstreaming, and we just highlight here 4 of them. Continuing deforestation, that's an obvious one, that this is a threat to biodiversity mainstreaming. Illegal forest activities and corruption, so activities which are not in line with laws, with agreements, etc. Low profile of conservation outside protected areas, that's unfortunately still true. So protected areas, everybody knows that's where protection is taking place. But outside protected areas, the profile or the attention to conservation is still rather low. Insufficient capacity. And finally, lack of indigenous peoples and local communities' participation. This is a topic which goes across many, obviously all aspects of forestry, but here in particular, biodiversity mainstreaming actually in the end happens on the ground. And if indigenous peoples and local communities don't have a benefit of that or are not involved, then we will not be successful. So it's a threat to biodiversity mainstreaming. The third part of the report is about basically from the findings and from these barriers to say, okay, what are now forest management measures to enhance biodiversity outcomes? Implementation of SFM based on best practices and continuous improvement, that's important. So to enrich sustainable forest management by really documented best practices and build on these best practices and improve the sustainable forest management in view of biodiversity mainstreaming. Assessing and managing risks of forest operations to biodiversity, that's very important. So the operations in forests to be mindful that there is a biodiversity mainstreaming component to take care of that. Establishing and managing set-aside areas, that's quite an important one. So in many cases, when forests are managed, there is a need to in fact set certain areas aside for really biodiversity conservation or mainstreaming. Maybe it's not everywhere possible, but to make sure there is enough area set aside in forest management which really has a biodiversity mainstreaming component as a priority. Retaining critical biodiversity resources, that's very clear. So it's talking about diverse, to make sure sustainable forest management is based on diverse species compositions. Sustainably managing timber resources and non-wood forest products, very important. Minimizing the environmental impact of forest operations, we said that already before. So because forest operations, they can be very damaging for biodiversity. So that's a very particular aspect of forest management where a lot of work is needed. Conserving genetic diversity, very important, to make sure rare species are not being compromised, that they are really getting attention. Managing and controlling invasive species, so to make sure or to try to minimize the impact of invasive species, and controlling encroachment, illegal activities, hunting and collection of non-wood forest products. Again, what we said before is one of the barriers or threats which was identified. Now, the last part of the report gives some recommendations how to do that. Some of the most urgent and impactful priorities to facilitate mainstreaming of biodiversity are reducing and eradication deforestation. I mean, that's an obvious one, but a very important one. Combating illegal and unregulated forest activities. recognizing forest tenure of indigenous peoples and local communities. Very important, the tenure rights. If that's not ensured, then the motivation or the incentive to actually mainstream biodiversity is not there. Preventing conversion of natural forests into monospecific forest plantations. And you saw again from Robert before, we can have plantations which are very rich. So it's basically to avoid monospecific forest activities. Ensuring sustainable management of harvested species. So to make sure that especially rare species and high-value species are not over-harvested, that they can maintain their diversity. Managing invasive and other abundant species, we said that before. Leveraging global momentum on restoration to enhance biodiversity. So to bring restoration and biodiversity mainstreaming at the global attention, and obviously the current process at the CBD is a very important one, where the post-2020 biodiversity framework is being developed, and to make sure that biodiversity of forest is being part of this global momentum. Adopting a multi-sectoral perspective, that's the landscape approach to mainstream biodiversity in a broader perspective of different land use systems. Providing economic incentives and removing perverse incentives. This is very important, especially for local communities, that they benefit from biodiversity mainstreaming, but in a way that is conserving and promoting biodiversity instead of doing the contrary. Facilitating market-based instruments, we talked about this before, payment for ecosystem services, whatever it is, and investing in knowledge and capacity development. So I hope colleagues from CIFOR and also Ken, who is online, and the whole team who has worked on this study, to have done justice just to give you the main findings, barriers and recommendations which are coming out of the study. What the study also has is a number of examples from different countries which are obviously not, which I didn't present here, but that's another part. So the second part of the study is really giving examples from countries, how actually, what are these experiences from different continents, from different countries in mainstream biodiversity, and what are the gaps and needs and lessons learned. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I hand over back to our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, and I guess that is also an invitation to the audience here in the room and the virtual audience to be a bit patient and to wait for this study to be published. My colleague from FAO, Kenichi Shono, may say a few words later on in the panel, and my colleague Rhett Harrison from ICRAF as well. He's involved in the study, and as importantly, as Thomas has said, there are 8 country case studies that are very rich and that exemplify in very telling ways some of the concrete ways on how to mainstream biodiversity in sustainable forest management. So bear with us, it's going to be published soon. Next speaker, I would like to call, I think it's online, but live, that Jamal Anagili Jova from the CBD Secretariat is going to talk. So handing to the technical team whether it is possible to put, oh,
yes,
wonderful.
Good morning.
Okay, we can hear you and loud and clear, and so the floor is yours, Jamal.
Good morning. Thank you, Vincent. And good morning, dear participants of the World Forest Congress. So just a quick question. I'm projecting my screen, right? Because I would like to use a few slides for my presentation. So while doing this, so I hope that you can see my presentation by now. And still can see me?
Not sure. Yes, we can. We can see you and have your presentation at the same time on the screen.
That's great. So thank you. And I really regret I could not join you in person for this very interesting discussion, for this very interesting session we're having today. But still, I'm glad that we have this opportunity, and I have this opportunity to present to you the talk, first of all, on behalf of the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and briefly tell you about the results achieved and lessons learned from the Aichi biodiversity targets, which have expired 2 years ago, and how are we applying those lessons learned for the design of the new post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So my name is Jamal Naklicheva. So I'm the part of the Science Policy and Governance Unit in the CBD Secretariat. So first of all, on the Aichi biodiversity targets, there have been many targets in the Aichi biodiversity framework, which have been dealing with directly or indirectly with the forest ecosystems. But there are two which were directly addressing the threats, the drivers of the forest loss, and the forest ecosystem restoration. So the target 5, which was aiming to reduce the deforestation loss by half or completely stopping it, reducing the degradation and fragmentation. And the target 15, which was talking about the restoration of the ecosystem, including forest ecosystem, with the aim of at least 15% of degraded ecosystem to be restored. Just jumping a bit ahead, I should say that those both targets of the Aichi, they were, and overall they were missed. But there are still some details and some nuances and progress which we can learn from, but also we can seemingly the same way learn also from the failures and the challenges we had for implementation of Aichi targets. So just as I mentioned, the two targets directly addressing the forest ecosystem in the previous expired biodiversity framework, the target 5, which was on the reducing deforestation loss, showed us that there was indeed the decrease in the net forest loss. And what you see now on the screen is the data from the FAO Forest Resource Assessment, which will be launched also during the Forest Congress. And indeed, you can see that the net forest loss has been decreasing over the last 30 years. And this is because on the one hand, we were reducing deforestation in some areas of the world, but also expanding the forest cover in another. But you can see also that the difference in the progress in the different regions of the world is striking. Under the same target 5 on reducing the rate of forest loss, we could still conclude that there was a continuing degradation and loss of the habitat. So it still remained high, and we were still losing the wilderness areas, and like more than 3 million square meters of wilderness area has been lost since the last 30 years. And by 2015, which was set by 7 years ago, there was the less of a quarter, 23% of wilderness areas remaining. So the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, which has been produced by scientists and validated by the country parties, they all agreed that this target has not been achieved or the progress has been poor. Quickly looking at the target 15 of the Aichi target 15, which was on the ecosystem restoration, with a 15% of ecosystem restoration to be degraded ecosystems to be restored. So the problem with this target was largely associated with our lack or incomplete understanding on the complexity of the concept of ecosystem restoration, or which then led to the problem of the definition of the baseline, data collection, national global data collection, and therefore it was simply difficult to produce the reliable data to evaluate this target. So as you can see now, the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5 assessed that the results, the progress is unknown. So, and the achievement of this target was inconclusive. But nevertheless, we all know that during the last 10 years, the last decade, there were many projects, programs, national initiatives which were successfully completed or underway. And they have multiple benefits for biodiversity, climate change, and for people. And this was, I think, the lack of our understanding and inability to evaluate this target and communicate our achievement. That was also one of the reasons why the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration has been launched, just to help to fill this gap. So briefly on the challenges and the implementation of the Aichi target, just what I have already mentioned, is a very complex dynamic of the ecosystem, and sometimes it's unpredictability. And of course, the lack of agreement on the indicators, how to measure progress, the baseline, so what I was studying from and where we're going. Also capacity, the lacking capacity, weak capacity of the countries to develop specific, measurable, achievable, time-bound targets for ecosystem restoration. And of course, also the due to financial restriction, social restriction, we also had a difficulty to identify. We had to work on the priority areas due to the financial restriction. And that's where we also had the difficulties really to agree where the priority areas from the point of view of biodiversity and from the point of view of other multiple benefits and cost-effective restoration actions. Lessons learned from Aichi targets and how we shall move forward is, of course, we need to agree on the baseline definition on ecosystem restoration, and this is what is happening right now during the negotiation of the post-2020 and its targets and the indicator framework. The benefit of the biodiversity could be included, for in that restoration target should be included, and of course, including the ecosystem services. Countries nationally, at the national level, they should be able to set up the explicit area-specific restoration targets. And as it was already mentioned by two key speakers, there are many spatial planning tools and which would help the countries to maximize the synergies and to identify the best solution, the most optimal solution to balance the trades-off. And we heard interesting examples on this. So with these lessons learned, although I have to say that in the Aichi target, the same as for the post-2020 biodiversity framework, there will not be a specific target for on the forest. They kind of wrapped up in the ecosystem restoration, but we still, for CBD, forest ecosystem is one of the most important ecosystem, and therefore, of course, depending on the national conditions and circumstances, we still consider that all ecosystems are important, and the interconnectivity between ecosystems is also now much better understood, but the forest ecosystem still keeps the central role in all the conservation, protection, and restoration targets. So now looking forward to the post-2020 biodiversity framework, as you know, this is under the negotiations, and we hope that the framework will be adopted this year. With a very ambitious vision, it comes, so that by 2050, and this is not even the long-term now vision, so 2050, we will live in harmony with nature. And we will come to that vision through our 2030 mission and targets. so that we need to take action across the society to conserve and sustainable use biodiversity. And the post-2020 biodiversity framework, those of you who have been involved or monitoring the negotiation, you have seen that a very ambitious process has been created through the open-ended working group to include all of the society, all of the stakeholders into the discussion and negotiation, the framework and its targets. And here, just a very brief kind of snapshot of the biodiversity framework. As you know, it's still under the negotiation. So therefore, some of the targets here you would see in brackets. The numeric targets are still in brackets, but the post-2020 framework is designed in the way, like through the three big elements. The one is on the reducing threats to biodiversity. The second one is on ecosystem services, where you're actually meeting the people's needs through the sustainable use and benefit sharing. And the third one is the tools and solution for implementation. And as you can see, I only drew few targets which are directly related to the forest ecosystem, which are contained in all of these three elements, so throughout the post-2020 framework. So under the first package, you will see that the countries are negotiating the 20%, at least 20%, and probably I should really leave these all the targets in brackets here because it's not yet adopted. So at least 20% of degraded terrestrial ecosystem are under restoration, connectivity, and the restoration happens, first of all, in the priority areas. We're also saying that at least 30% of global land should be conserved, but well connected through the protected areas. So countries also discussing the target on minimizing the impact of climate change and biodiversity using the ecosystem-based approaches, but also within that target that all climate mitigation and adaptation measures do not harm biodiversity. And in the second block of the biodiversity framework, you could see that two targets are also related to forest and trees. That first of all areas under agriculture, forestry are managed sustainably. There is also a target on increasing of green and blue spaces, especially in the densely populated areas. And finally, in the last element of the post-2020, a very important target is on the redirecting, repurposing, or eliminating incentives harmful to biodiversity. So this is a very quick snapshot of how the framework is now negotiated. And I also would like to show you this slide just to show you the complexity of the discussion which happens in parallel to the targets of the post-2020 is a discussion of the monitoring and indicators framework for post-2020. The headline indicators should be agreed by the countries and validated, should be national, regionally, globally relevant. The headline indicators for 21 targets. They will be supported by the component indicators and the complementary indicators. So, and finally, this is my last slide. I would like to say that in the CBD Secretariat, we stand ready to support the countries, especially the developing countries, to implement the post-2020 targets as soon as they're adopted. We ran a forest ecosystem restoration initiative with financial assistance of the Korea Forest Service and the so-called FAO. So FAO is supporting developing countries in the planning and implementation ecosystem restoration. So what we plan for this year, even before the post-2020 is adopted, we're working on the spatial assessment tool, we're working on the optimization tool. We will be training countries how to use these tools. We will be organizing the massive online open course on the ecosystem restoration so that the countries can train their expert, and they will have the certified expert in ecosystem restoration so that they will not lose the time to design the new generation of the national biodiversity framework, and would include area-specific and ambitious target on the forest ecosystem restoration and other ecosystem restorations. So I would stop here, and I would be happy to participate in the further discussion during the panel discussion and respond to questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamal, and indeed, please stay with us and in the room, and thanks for recalling the mission and the vision of the CBDs, putting biodiversity on a path to recovery that will go through forest, and in fact through forest and people, to implement sustainable forest management that is conducive to biodiversity. Last speaker of our initial presentation round is Shim Shatkuru, the Executive Director from ITTO. So Shim, the floor is yours for your key elements.
Thank you very much, Vincent, and a very good morning to every participant, whether online or in person. My name is Sham Satkuru, and I come from the ITTO. And I would like to share some of our wonderful experiences that we have had in the work of conservation of biodiversity. ITTO is very thankful, actually, to the cooperation that we have had in organizing this joint session, together with our colleagues from the FAO, CBD, and CIFOR. ITTO has over 30 years of experience in encouraging and promoting the implementation of sustainable forest management in tropical countries that safeguards biodiversity, which enables indigenous and local communities to generate income and supports tropical countries to pursue sustainable development. So I just have a few slides to share with you in order to take you through the successful examples of work that we have conducted. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. The work that we do is underpinned by one of the 4 newly council-approved ITTO programmatic lines, and as you can see, it's the second one. There is no order of importance in the way these programmatic lines are arranged. All of them are of equal priority to the International Tropical Timber Organization. So the second one is focused on the conservation of biodiversity and ecosystem services. The rest of it will be bedtime reading for all of you today. Next slide, please. Now, what I'm going to take you through here actually addresses all the key findings in the yet unpublished FAO-CIFOR study that Thomas talked about earlier in his speech. And it also addresses a number of the key areas that our keynote speaker, Robert Nasi, mentioned in his opening speech for this session. I wish to focus on the ITTO CBD Collaborative Initiative for Tropical Forest Biodiversity. Now, this initiative had a number of importance of biodiversity in productive forest landscapes. And it was designed actually to focus on production forests and for the rehabilitation of degraded and secondary forests. It was especially associated with improving the conservation and the management of protected areas, in addition to the production forests, while it buffers the protected areas. So you see there is a dual purpose there, both in the protected forests as well as in the production forests. And all of the work that was conducted was aimed at safeguarding tropical forest biodiversity in forestry interventions, which included, of course, the REDD+ related projects. And this was done while improving the welfare of local communities and indigenous groups through biodiversity conservation. Next slide, please. Oops. Yeah, so we had a publication on the initiative, and you will be able to find this on the ITTO website if you wish to download it. And it has been pursued by the wider application of the ITTO and the IUCN guidelines for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity in tropical timber production forests. No doubt it is dated 2009, but it is still very much applicable and apt, with a few modifications, even in the year 2022. Next slide, please. So this is the implementation of the ITTO CBD initiative. You can see it on the map and the number of projects that were actually conducted. And out of the achievements, it supported 16 projects in 23 tropical forest countries. Next slide, please. The main ones are bullet pointed on this slide, and as you can see, the expansion of a mangrove protected forest area to the size of 700,000 hectares is nothing to laugh about. That was such an achievement. The next one, of course, was a better understanding of biodiversity elements in terms of animal movements and habitat conservation in the Emerald Triangle forest between Cambodia and Thailand. There was a smaller one of mangrove forests in Fiji, and more than 400 foresters in Central Africa were trained in sustainable forest management under this initiative. Next slide, please. Now, the lessons learned from the ITTO CBD initiative, I think, would match a number of the lessons learned also from the study that Thomas mentioned, and also from the work that is being conducted by the CBD, which Jamal took us through recently. What we found is it can be readily applied to future projects. This is so important. Even when I was speaking at another session yesterday, I did alert our audiences that a number of international organizations such as ITTO has conducted on-the-ground projects that are scalable and replicable in different countries and different regions of the world. No doubt, some of these projects may need slight adaptation to match national needs and national necessities, but at the same time, we need to be cautious, particularly in terms of limited resources that are coming or going from one way or the other. There are trillions and billions of dollars being talked about, but it's also important not to reinvent the wheel. I would urge the whole donor community to please take this into full account, that work that has been conducted in the last 3 or 4 decades, ITTO, for example, 36 years of its existence, we have conducted a lot of work on the ground, and all this work can be reapplied in many different parts of the world, which is, I'm not talking about a cost-saving exercise here. Sure, we need to think about that, but we keep being warned all the time by the donor community that resources coming into international organizations and multilateral funding is reducing year by year. Yet, we see quite a lot of bilateral funding that is pouring out in billions, either to individual countries or to the regions. So I personally, and the organization also, I would dare say, would very much support co-benefits. In other words, equitable sharing of benefits, rather than 100% transfer of credits or trading. Because we have seen mechanisms over the years that may not have worked soundly enough to be attractive to both donors and beneficiary countries. Anyway, what we also found through this successful collaborative initiative that we had with the CBD is that all projects should consult regularly, and we should enable the involvement of local communities and indigenous groups in the areas of influence. What is not on the slide, but is equally important to the ITTO, is the involvement of women. Involvement and the empowerment of women in the implementation of this project. So we have a number of examples which we have conducted also in Togo, successfully implemented, and the Ivory Coast. and in different parts of Cameroon. If you look up our website, you will find these projects there. The indigenous and other local communities must derive benefits from such projects. This was also mentioned by our speakers prior to my speaking, and the traditional land rights and practices must be enabled to continue. There should also be very clear indicators which need to be established in order for, semi-accurate or more accurate measuring of the effectiveness of such projects in terms of addressing long-term livelihoods, sustainability, and biodiversity conservation. Next slide, please. The political support at all levels is also incredibly important, particularly in the participant countries. It is essential for the success of transboundary conservation. This is another area that ITTO has worked on, and we have executed projects that cross the boundaries of at least 3 to 4 countries. Please look up the website. There is an example that we have shown you, which was actually executed through the CBD ITTO initiative. I talked about measurable indicators already, so that you can measure the progress and see what else needs to be improved for the future. And the next slide, please. Moving forward, the ITTO and the CBD initiative, both organizations formally renewed our collaborative spirit to jointly work towards 2025 in a new memorandum of understanding. And this actually evidences our long-term commitment, both organizations that is, to enhancing the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. By the year 2025, we will be 5 years away from the 2030 shorter-term vision targets. And it is our hope, and we are confident that we will reach even closer to what it is that all of us are aiming for. The second bullet point I also mentioned earlier, we need to facilitate and also we need to enhance access to bilateral and multilateral funding, particularly through the larger funding bodies such as the GAF, the GCF, the GGGI, and several other funding opportunities. We continue to work with our partners all over the world to support the achievement, of course, of the SDGs, while we remain fully committed to the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, again, deadline of 2030, and we are also paying very close attention and contributing to the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. We very much look forward to continuing our work together with the FAO-CIFOR and the CBD, who are partners to this joint session, to accelerate our efforts towards 2030. With that, I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiem, for pointing to the achievements and also the ground to move ahead on the ITTO-CBD joint initiative on biodiversity, and for pointing to the importance of dealing with production forests very seriously. And this brings us to our next speaker, because when, with our colleagues, we crafted this session, we said that the extreme spectrum of the production forest, there are plantation forests, including intensive plantations, and they have also been interrogated as how they could contribute to improving biodiversity in different ways. So this is today Francisco Cesar Razzolini from Klabin in Brazil. So Francisco, I'm not sure if you are online, but the floor is yours.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello, a warm welcome and good morning for all of you in Seoul. I've just passed midnight here in São Paulo, Brazil. So hello, I would like to share you quickly a quick presentation of Klabin, the company that I work for. And that, as you mentioned, we are on the business of forest, but with this integrated conservation of the native forest, together with the high-intensive forest plantation. So our company, Klabin, is a quite long history in Brazil, 123 years. We just completed now, April 21st. So long time for a Brazilian company, quite new in this new world. We are integrated from forest to pulp papers and also paper packaging. So we are working in the whole this chain of custody, implementing a good kind of cluster from forest to products in our areas. Klabin has set very high in his agenda the sustainable development. So in 2020, we announced our targets for 2030 that we call CODS, Klabin Objectives for Sustainable Development. This is targeting 14 SDGs from the United Nations on our strategic planning, in our projects, in our implementations, and also in our management. And from that, we established 23 goals, and that 5 are directly related to biodiversity. So biodiversity is very well integrated into our day-to-day operations and policy. We use as a wood supply 2 exotic species from Brazil. One is the softwood coming from the loblolly pine, like the Taeda pinus, and also the eucalyptus hardwoods. As you can see from my slides, we have very high productivity in our areas. That's the subtropical area of Brazil. So for part of the country, that's very high. We are located down south from São Paulo, in southern area of Brazil, as I mentioned, in the areas called states of Paraná and Santa Catarina. In our area, in total area today, we had preserved 43% of our areas with native forest. So these are the figures that we have today as planted and preserved. So on that preservation, how it's being done and integrated, we do this mosaic system of forest management. So that gives a very sustainable forest management practice all together with the biodiversity. You see the very uniform are the plantations, and let's say the more scattered trees out there are the native species. So the native forests preserved there, forming kind of ecological corridors, also preserve river corps and springs, and also protects a lot of the fauna and the flora. So our protection for natural resources enhance also the productivity and collaborations with the preservation. In our area, we identified a lot of wildlife and also biodiversity on fauna and flora. So we have identified more than 800 species, especially in the large mammals like the pumas, the brockets, or monkeys, holler monkeys, and others, and also almost 2,000 species today. So we have this kind of integrated biodiversity into our plantations. And today, yes?
No, Francisco, just sorry to interrupt. We had a technical problem to show your slide. So if you could please tell us which slide we should display right now to catch up here in the room.
So I will stop sharing. I will stop sharing. You can go to the biodiversity slide that I was mentioning.
Okay, so. Perhaps you should, yes, what should? Yeah, you would need to control the presentation yourself. Yeah, that would be better.
Okay, let me then try to share that again with you guys. Sorry.
No, it's us being sorry for the technical glitch.
Okay, are you guys seeing my presentation back again?
Not yet. I'm looking at the technical team behind.
Maybe there is any delay here on the system, but okay.
I see the presentation. Okay, now it's presented. Okay, it's displayed now.
Okay, thank you, sorry. We also have identified species on the IUCN Red List for fauna and flora. Yeah, and this is a very nice work that the Brazilian tree industry is doing. You may hear some presentations about the group that is there in Korea, especially I think Patricia Machado, that may be on the area with you guys today. On the audience, and they will also launch a kind of report where they see also the biodiversity into the whole Brazilian tree industry. Okay. This led us in Klabin to be FSC certified since 1998. So it's a recognition of that the use of our forest and the practice that we are doing are facing all the economical, social, and environmental perspectives from the FSC certification. And we also now are increasing the extension of the FSC certification also for ecosystem services like the ES1 from biodiversity conservation, ES2 from carbon sequestration and storage, and also the hydrographic basis conservation and services. So very interesting. So a bit about what we do have about contributions for other areas is the carbon balance from the overall emissions that we do have from our operations, and also the forest removal. We have a net 4.7 million tons of CO2 removal per year. And so a bit about what else we are doing, not only on the forest side, but also on the industrial side, is to reduce then the water intake. This is also taking care of the natural resources and improve the biodiversity, and also reduce a lot the greenhouse gas emissions. So this is, in our view, what can sustainable forests do for development is always an integration of the silviculture practice, all the genetic selection of the materials, the best material for each area, but also the full integration with the environment. And environmental means also biodiversity. So this is a brief introduction of what we've been doing, and I'll be here for the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco. Also midnight time in Brazil, I guess. I would like to call all the panelists, the speakers, keynote speakers, and the panelists to the podium, just to gain time while we hear our next and last panelist, Shemuku Wekeza from the Kenya Forestry Research Institute, who will tell us about the challenges and opportunity to reconcile community livelihood needs and biodiversity conservation in the Taita Hills landscape in Kenya. So, Wekeza, the floor is yours, and then we'll have a short discussion.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm honored to be part of this discussion. I'm going to share some of the experiences that we have had in Taita Hills landscape in Kenya, which is part of the Eastern Arc Mountain, one of the global biodiversity hotspots in my country. And this area is one of the areas that are...
Doesn't poke me in the eye.
Are you able to get me? So this area is highly fragmented because of the growing human population. And over the last 200 years has seen the landscape lose about 98% of the forest cover. So we have very small forest cover remaining, less than 500 hectares. And at the moment, the latest studies that we have undertaken shows that deforestation rate still stands at almost 0.5 per year. And as you can see from the picture on the left. This is the landscape, and people are moving up and up and occupying some of the forested areas. The picture here also shows a homestead whereby you see houses just coming up very close to the forest, encroaching those forest areas. But with community engagement and stakeholders working together, communities have put in place some strategies that can help conserve this particular area because of the rich biodiversity it harbors. And I'm just going to share some of these strategies. And one of the strategies, I'm not able to move my slides. Okay, it is moving. So one of the strategies that the communities are applying is the issue of ecotourism. And we have like a local CBO that have put up camping sites within the various small forest blocks that are remaining. And these campsites, because of the rich biodiversity of the landscape and its strategic location within the greater Tsavo National Park ecosystem, the area receives a high number of tourists. So the campsites play host to tourists, and the community members through the Tabico CBO who own the campsites are able to generate revenue and income from both the camping fee and also the tour guiding fee. The other strategy is beekeeping. And on this, we have about 17 beekeeping groups within the landscape, with about 132 modern beehives, which have been installed in different forest fragments. And these beehives generate honey twice a year, and the honey is sold to generate income. We have branded the honey, it's called Taita Hills honey, and is very popular due to increasing demand of the market. And here you can see a beehive installed in one of the forest fragments. Then the other economic activity that the community is engaged in is butterfly farming. Of course, it's on small scale because it's when the community is starting this particular initiative, and they are borrowing a lot from another butterfly farming project, which is very popular in my country, somewhere down the coast, called Kipepeo project. And the community rare butterfly, and these butterfly are exported at the pupa stage through now the main Kipepeo project to generate income to the local community. And by so doing, the community can utilize the forest in an unconservative manner and protect and preserve the rich biodiversity that exists within the forest. But the butterfly are not only sold. We have those that are endangered, and which the communities have realized that they are in danger of going extinct. So what the community is doing is also raising this butterfly in their butterfly house and releasing the population of this butterfly back to the forest. You can see a butterfly farm on the edge of one of the forest fragments that is called Chawia. Then the other initiative is the issue of agroforest belt. As I mentioned earlier, this is a highly fragmented area, and the forest suffers a lot from the age effect. which has had detrimental effects on some of the tree species, particularly Coffea fadeni, Afrocarpus usambarensis, which are listed as endangered in IUCN Red List. So to be able to kind of moderate the age effect, the community have come up with an initiative to set up agroforest beds on the boundaries or on the edges of those forest fragments using Gravilia robusta, which is a very popular species, agroforest species. And this is able to kind of minimize the changes in microclimatic condition on the edges and allow those indigenous species that are threatened and which have been exposed because of the age effect to thrive. And for this belt, a combination of Gravilia, which is exotic, and Albizia are used, and mainly because they are able to fix nitrogen, improve the microclimatic condition, and allow those indigenous tree species to thrive. And this belt have a width of about 10 meters from the forest to the where the community now land start. And this has been done through negotiation among community members, forest authorities, and other stakeholders involved in conservation. And the communities also do have community nurseries to provide quality seedlings to support restoration efforts, and also sell some of these seedlings to the market where the demand is very high due to restoration efforts being promoted by government, NGOs, and other stakeholders engaged in conservation in my country. And of course, when these seedlings are sold, a portion of it is plowed back into conservation. Most community nurseries plow back between 20 and 30%. And lastly, the local people. I don't have a slide on this, but the local people have also set aside some areas, traditional areas, which are outside protected areas. And most of the speakers who came before me talked about this. And these areas, though outside protected areas, they play a very key role in conserving biodiversity and also act as water catchment areas. And in their own local language, they call them mitengo. So these mitengo are traditionally protected areas within the landscape. And there are committees that have been set up by the community to oversee the mitengo so that they are protected. They have rules that they adhere to protect those mitengo areas for biodiversity conservation and also for water catchment reasons. And remember, Taita Hills landscape is one of the gazetted water catchment area in my country. So in doing all these efforts, the community are able to strike a balance between biodiversity and their needs, their own needs, the needs for water, the needs for income, the needs for herbal medicine, the needs for and other basic needs that are required to support livelihoods. So they are really balancing and ensuring that biodiversity, conservation, and their local needs are reconciled in a way that can be sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shemuku. And let's now use the 10 minutes ahead to have a short discussion, and then I'll invite Thomas to close the session. As a note, I find very striking the fact that we've seen in this session, despite the short amount of time, quite interesting examples on how managing forests, and often by communities, can really be conducive to more biodiversity, but also livelihood objectives, as we've just shown seen here in Kenya. So my question perhaps to the panelists is in between these situations where there is a biodiversity crisis and there are big global commitments at the global level, and then at the local level, still quite a number of very diverse ways and examples on how we can concretely do things, and a track record, as I think Shim has also shown. What's missing? Is there a missing middle in terms of technical, institutional, or economic? What's missing to move ahead and to go towards perhaps the targets that are being constructed?
Yeah, thank you, Vincent. I mean, that's a perennial problem. I mean, you have all these grand plans that are designed in the buildings of the country or in the convention, and so we are going to have the biodiversity target. There are trillions of dollars that are floating around. The problem is that the people in the Tarais, they don't need $1 trillion. They may need 1,000, and there is no mechanism to move from this $1 trillion to the 1,000 that you give to the ground. And that's really what's missing. I mean, how do you make sure that the money reach the people that need it, and the fact that our financial mechanism, they are not really designed for this sort of thing. And that's part of what Shim was saying also. And we need to revise this sort of flow of funding, and also having the sort of the big thinker in the air-conditioned room realizing what is happening on the ground, because very often a government is saying we have a pledge in restoration without a single clue of what their own people are doing in terms of restoration in the ground.
Thank you, Vincent. Robert, so well said. Robert just hit the nail on the head about 5 times, I think. Now, organizations like the ITTO has been sweating on trying to make the higher echelons understand how important it is for these smaller projects on the ground. Okay, if they want something worth 10 million, 50 million, we can come up with that. Between the 4 of us, we could get together, we could come up with an initiative that's worth about 200 million. Am I right? You know? But they need to be ready to talk to us to understand what is it that these projects capture. I really liked, Chimuku's example in Kenya. ITTO has also done projects like that. So you see, the efforts are there. When I said earlier not to reinvent the wheel, I did not mean that we should not look for innovative ways forward. That's critical. We need innovative ways forward. But sometimes the old-fashioned established stuff gets forgotten, you know. When people start talking about innovation, they wipe the slate clean on all the work that has already been conducted for like 30 or 40 years, where millions of dollars have been poured into these efforts, millions of investment on both sides, by the donor community and the producing countries also, you know. It's a lot of investment, and I don't just talk about financial investment. So what's missing is, I think, we need to make these communications clearer. In other words, you know, our advocacy, communications, and outreach efforts needs to step up much more, and it would really help, actually, at international meetings such as this, and there are several that go on over the world, that people like us are actually requested to attend and requested to have exchanges with the larger bodies. I mean, we can try as much as we want to request audiences with the higher echelons. Whether they accept to see us, of course, is entirely up to them.
Thanks.
Do I need to say anything?
No,
thank you.
I would like, no, thank you, Shim. I think that's, I would like to give the opportunity to our online panelists also to say a few words. We see them in front of us, and the room is seeing you. So yes, Jamal.
Yes, thank you very much. And I've really enjoyed this very interesting discussion on such a diverse presentation. And just coming to your question, Vincent, it's really, you just hit the point. So we have a lot of discussion happening now at the global level. And of course, by this, I mean, first of all, the post-2020 biodiversity framework. And at the same time, we see already ongoing a very interesting, successful initiatives on the ground. And, but still, I would complement our distinguished panel now here, of course, from more institutional point of view of the multilateral environmental agreement, that we will have a chance, and I would say this is a rather time-fixed window, that when the post-2020 is adopted, and hopefully it will happen this year, that the national governments will start planning and design of the national targets based on the global. So I like the word domesticate. So the countries will have a task to domesticate whatever was set up as the global ambitious target. And they will think of how many % of the ecosystem they need to restore, where, and how they shall address the drivers of the forest loss. And I think that will be a critical moment where the organization like yours, the technical organization, in a partnership with the CBD, will be coming together to the government, because we still need a kind of a streamlined process, because as you just mentioned, there are many initiatives in the countries and the regional initiatives which they're already committing and implementing their programs on the restoration. So bringing that to the country level in the partnership. So for me, that's the main point. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamal. So not only trees can be domesticated, but targets should be domesticated as well. And yes, there is Shemuku, the hand, yes, please.
Okay, thank you. I think we also need to tap in the rich traditional knowledge and local knowledge which the communities have, and we need to learn from them and allow the community to also participate actively, even in forums like these ones, where we can give some community members an opportunity to come and share their experiences based on what they are doing on the ground. The issue of peer learning and exchange learning, I think, is something that is missing, and also engagement of communities at all levels, and at the same time tapping in the rich traditional and local knowledge that the communities have. Thank you.
Yes, and spaces and ways by which also communities can exchange. Yes, this is Francisco, yes.
Hi, yes, just to mention that we are living in a very important moment where biodiversity is also coming to the sports, but it's a very important era now where the sustainable economy is growing. So sustainable forest, sustainable development is all integrated in our views by any different approaches, like intensive forests like we do, integrated with these native areas, respecting biodiversity and natural resources, but also with the small programs that we are doing with native forests. So all in all, I think it's a very interesting moment that we now should do really the use of the wood and promote that, and the conservation of the forest, and also the sustainable forest management. This is all integrated. And just for you to notice, in Brazil, we do only have 8 million hectares of planted forest. This is 1% of the Brazilian territory today. And we have more than double that of degraded areas. So we can grow our forests in Brazil by restoring areas with native species, but also using part of that with very productive forests. So I think we all should benefit from that. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco. Is there any final comment? Because Thomas, I will give Thomas the floor to conclude, but Thomas, maybe you want just to react before you...
No, I will conclude.
You will conclude and react. So then, looking at the clock, it's 12:30, so I guess this is the end of our session, so we can move to that. But just before giving the floor to Thomas, I would like to just, for the conclusion, just give a round of applause to all our speakers and panelists, keynote speakers. I think that when we crafted this session together with our colleagues from FAO, ITTO, and the CBD Secretariat, we really had this idea that we can bring some of the message in the perspective of the next, in fact, big moments that are coming ahead. So I guess this will be taken on board when we finalize this publication we were mentioning before. So Thomas, the floor is yours to conclude.
Thank you, Vincent. Colleagues, when we shaped this session, in fact, we were talking a lot about commitments. We said there are all these meetings where commitments are being made, and then we asked our question, what about the implementation? And I think that was one of the key things which came through this session, that there is a lot of practical implementation of commitments is available. So it's a very positive message to say there is a lot of work, but we have a lot of stories we can use and tell and disseminate. And I mean, in this study we are publishing very soon, there are these case studies, but also what we heard from Francisco and Chemuku. I mean, these are very concrete examples on the ground where we can say commitments are being implemented. And that's for me a very, very positive outcome. And I think that this came across the whole session. The second point, I think, is in a way in agreement that production of forests and protection of biodiversity is not contradictory. The important thing is the sustainable use, and we saw that there are even examples where sustainable use is even furthering or promoting biodiversity. So that's the second very strong message, I think, which came across. Sustainable use is the way to go, and not either protect or produce. It's sustainable use which ultimately helps us with biodiversity mainstreaming. The third point is what Chemuku just highlighted once again. I think biodiversity mainstreaming requires full participation of communities on the ground, using their local knowledge, giving them the space to implement their achievements, their aspirations and so on, and having a voice. I think that's very important. And the fourth one, which was not necessarily discussed here, but which is fundamental, is the youth involvement, because ultimately when we talk about biodiversity mainstreaming, this is something which has to do with awareness raising, which has to do with education. So it has to do with the future decision makers, and that's our youth. And that's why we are very happy that we have a strong youth participation in this Congress, because that's ultimately where these are the people who will ultimately implement decision makers in the future, and they need to have their voice and their ideas in this whole discussion. So these are just 4 very brief comments, and I would like to thank our colleagues, you know, the co-organizers, CIFOR, ITTO, and CBD, Jamal, who is online, for a very productive preparation of this session and implementation. And for me, the important thing is the process, you know, and we will continue with that. I mean, this has shaped our partnerships, and we will continue, and also with our colleagues who are connected online. But I would like to thank also our technicians here, and on behalf of, all the technicians working here, you are doing wonders to have people here. We see the 3 colleagues from all over the world online, and then we even see a PowerPoint here. This is technologically very complex, and I thank you for having managed this so successfully. And finally, I would like to thank all the interpreters also for their hard work in this session, but during the week. And finally, to all of you for your participation. We will stay tuned for the next session of Sub-Theme 2, which will happen this afternoon at 4 o'clock. But obviously, there are many other sessions also happening. So I wish you a very successful stay in this Congress throughout the week. And hopefully, you will take home long-lasting ideas, recommendations, inspiration for your future work. Thank you so much. Have a good lunch. Thank you.
Photo.
Huh? Yes. Okay. Wonderful. Super.